welcome to this episode of the Carer Project podcast series. My name's Christine and I'm here today with Gun and Tracy. Hi guys.
Hello. Hi Christine.
Hi, nice to have you here. So this podcast series is exploring what we found in a big research project that we've been doing about carer mental health. In this episode we're going to be looking at some of the results and findings from the work that we've been doing, and we'll be focusing in particular on what we've called carers' own internal processes. We'll tell you a little bit more about what that means in a minute. For those of you who are new to the podcast series, and maybe this is your first episode, we'll get Gun to talk a little bit about what the project is actually about overall. And for those of you who've already listened to a couple of episodes, thank you for bearing with us while we catch everybody up. So Gun, can you tell us a little bit about this project, please?
Yes, in a nutshell, the background to the project is that we know that family members and friends play a really big role in supporting and looking after people who are nearing the end of their lives. Mm-hmm. But we also know that this can have a big impact on these carers' own mental health. And so what the project's trying to do is to find out what the factors are that affect carers' mental health, what makes it better, what makes it worse during end-of-life caregiving. And what we're doing is we're gathering all the research evidence to date that tells us about what factors affect carers' mental health, and we're trying to summarize that in such a way that it's easy to easily readable and understandable for different stakeholders such as carers themselves, or health and social care practitioners, policymakers, commissioners and so on, so that they can actually make use of this evidence to think about ways they can improve carers' mental health during end-of-life caregiving.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll talk a little bit about at the end about some of the ways we might be able to use the information we talk about today. But for anybody who is interested, we've got a lot more information on our website, and we've got some really in-depth reports. So what we'll talk about today is really just a summary of one of the sort of group or themes that we've discovered. But there's a lot more information and a lot more resources as well, things that you might be able to use in your own practice. So do have a look on our website at what else we've got available. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about carers' own internal processes, and this is one of 7 themes. Tracy, do you want to say a little bit about what our themes are and how we've come up with these themes?
Yeah, sure. So we've got 7 themes overall. We've got patient condition, impact of caring responsibilities, quality of relationships, finances, carers' own internal processes that we're focusing on today, support and contextual factors. And these are themes that came out of our research, the research evidence that we were looking at. And what we looked at was carers' experiences and their stories in terms of what helps their mental health and what affects their mental health. And from looking at that information and gathering that evidence, we came up with these themes about what's important for carers in terms of considering their mental health.
Okay, and I think those things as well were discussed with our review advisory panel, which is people who've been carers themselves, and they contributed to saying that yes, these themes are relevant to us, and this is a good way to phrase them as well. They helped us come up with some of the words and phrases that we used, didn't they? Yeah. And again, we've got a really great podcast by one of our review advisory panel members, Jackie, who came in earlier on today to talk to us about their involvement. And that one really is worth a listen. So do have a look at the other podcasts that we've got available in this series. So as we've mentioned, we are focusing today on carers' own internal processes. And that's a real technical sort of term. I don't think it's intuitive what that actually means. So what do we mean when we're talking about that?
Yeah, so I mean that's obviously a term that we've used to describe overall the sort of the evidence that we found, but ultimately it relates to how carers' mental health is affected by how carers think and feel about themselves and their experiences of caregiving and how they look to cope with and manage these processes. And it's also about their sort of their belief in themselves and their confidence in themselves to carry out tasks and self-belief. Okay. And also preparedness for caring as well. That's another sort of feature of this theme.
Okay. And so what exactly have we found? What was out there on this topic?
Well, it's actually quite difficult to summarise because there's been a lot of research looking at carers' internal processes, both kind of their own experiences and also this numerical statistical data that shows relationship between measured internal processes and mental health. And the evidence is actually quite mixed, which I suppose is interesting in its own right. But there's certain things we can start to pull out from the evidence. One thing we seem to be seeing is that what we call self-efficacy, which is more about a person's confidence in themselves as carers to carry out caregiving tasks. This self-efficacy was related to better carer mental health. So if you're confident about your caregiving,
that makes sense.
That makes sense. Also, where carers felt helpless or guilty because they felt they couldn't do anything for the patient, they had worse mental health. Again, that seems to be makes sense. We had some studies that found that people's preparedness for caregiving related to better mental health, improved quality of life, less anxiety, depression, and so on.
So if they were prepared, if they'd done caregiving before, did that mean they were more prepared and had better mental health?
Well, actually, that's where the results are a bit contradictory, because generally, if you felt better prepared, or sort of sense of preparedness, you did better. But we did find that carers who had given care to a loved one in the past actually reported worse health.
Oh, that's interesting.
Indicating that having had that lived experience of it from past caregiving may not be protective.
Yeah, maybe they understand the day-to-day realities of what they're going to have to go through, and as prepared as they feel for that, that as you say, it doesn't have that protective factor because they sort of know what they're in for, so maybe it's almost a bit daunting in some respect. I don't know, I might feel like that when I know I'm going up against something that's been challenging in the past.
It's difficult to know, and also, but you also wonder if it brings back maybe distressing memories from that previous experience.
Yeah.
So we don't know, but we know that actually having had this experience in the past could make things worse.
Yeah, and it's interesting that those two things don't follow each other, isn't it? The preparedness and the past experience.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about that in terms of we have some recommendations, from our carers, and bespoke support was important for carers, and just thinking about experiences that, looking after patients that, even though a carer may have experienced, caring in the past, that the experience the next time might be different as well.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Because if it's a different family member as well, if you were looking after a spouse one time, but now, heaven forbid, but maybe it be your child, or, it's going to be a very different experience as well, isn't it? So it's going to require perhaps different help and different support.
Sure, and also what we've obviously talked about in a previous podcast, patient condition. So again, if the condition of the patient is different that the carer is looking after, so that may have an effect or, an impact on carers' mental health.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. So what else have we found about these internal processes?
Well, if carers start to experience grief before their loved one has died, which is pre-loss grief as we call it, then that understandably was also linked to worse mental health during caregiving. And then you have things like when the carer feels they have enough time for themselves, they experience better mental health, better quality of life. And yet we didn't find any association with activities undertaken outside caregiving. So, the other activities didn't seem to have a protective effect. However, if you have strong religious or spiritual beliefs, that seems to preserve your mental health.
Oh, that's interesting.
So
and there wasn't a lot more information. Was that just one study? There wasn't a lot of information about that?
A lot of this is based on single studies. So again, it's difficult to sort of really tease out the strong messages and factors from this particular body of evidence.
Yeah, it just gives us a flavour of what might be, but definitely more research to figure out if it's consistent and what the other things influencing that, what the story really is, and getting it all unpicked. That's interesting though. And was there anything else about carer internal processes that we found?
Well, I suppose the really tricky thing to make sense of is there were quite a lot of studies looking at carers' coping strategies, but that was again, that was quite mixed, sometimes a bit contradictory.
And why do you think that was? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think a lot of this comes down to kind of how people define and measure coping strategies.
Because it is a really vast body of work within I'm a psychologist, and there's a huge amount of work on coping strategies, and that's before we start getting into particular groups like end-of-life care and things like that. And it's just massive, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think one of the problems might be, for instance, some of these studies use measures that ask people, what their coping strategies are, but that's kind of almost on a theoretical level. It doesn't necessarily mean that those are the actual coping strategies they're going to use on the ground in that particular situation of looking after their loved ones. So it's actually quite difficult to study coping strategies in a meaningful way. And people's strategies change depending on what's happening, what the situation is, and so on. So that also means you might get quite sort of differing evidence, and difficult to tease out clear factors.
Because I was thinking about the term, say for example, dysfunctional coping strategies that have been termed as such. But actually talking to carers and their experiences that what might be classed as dysfunctional, say for example in a measurement tool, can actually be quite helpful to carers. So for example, having time for oneself might be seen as not having one time or meeting one's needs might be seen as dysfunctional, but actually for a carer caring for somebody that they care about, actually wanting to put their needs aside and actually give that time to the person they're caring for can actually also be sort of beneficial and positive for them, because actually they don't want to just be looking after themselves. It has a negative feel for them. So I think there's that going on as well in terms of how coping strategies are labelled, that what might be labelled as negative or dysfunctional can actually be quite helpful for some people in certain circumstances.
Definitely. And I know when I've spoken to carers in other projects, we talk about respite or going on holiday, and they said, you've made that sound jolly, and actually I wouldn't want to go on holiday because I would feel guilty. So they don't want that time for themselves. And
feel worse.
So that's interesting. So it's not surprising, basically, what we're saying, that with all these different ways of conceptualising coping strategies, measuring coping strategies, and then the fact that we can't just lock people up in a lab and watch how they react to the events unfolding around them and see which of their coping strategies they've used, it means that when we go in, perhaps with a questionnaire, such as a lot of these studies will have done, it's actually really hard to capture what's going on the ground in real life for these people. So it's perhaps not surprising that we're getting this mixed evidence about whether there's an effect on negative mental health or no effect at all, or a positive effect, for example. I think perhaps the only sort of maybe summary you could make is this about, if carers feel confident about what they're doing, and have a sense of coping well and dealing well with the caregiving tasks. I think that may be generally linked to better mental health. But then it's difficult to tell, what's cause and what's effect here. Sure, exactly.
Because if you feel less depressed, less anxious, maybe that's what makes you feel, I'm coping better with the caregiving tasks.
So it's not as simple as saying a practitioner should go in and intervene on that level and maybe bolster somebody's self-confidence or their self-esteem, because there might be other factors which have affected that in the first place, and if they're missing, maybe just increasing someone's self-esteem isn't going to have that effect.
But I think also, on the other hand, logically, I think if carers don't know what they're doing and they're kind of groping around in the dark and trying to figure out what on earth do I do now? that probably isn't going to make you feel more calm. You're probably going to get more anxious and distressed. So you can see how it would work in the other direction as well. That if you're not sort of self-confident, if you don't feel this self-efficacy, if you're not prepared, you can also see how that could contribute.
So rather than, instead of thinking about what we might call a complex intervention, thinking about sending somebody for cognitive behavioural therapy or some counselling or what have you, it might be as easy as, you know, if you're sat in a room with a carer, just saying, so how do you feel you're getting on with your tasks? And, you know, do you feel confident? Do you need more training with that? You know, what it might be just a case of explaining to somebody how to do that thing, or showing them how to dress a wound, or, you know, help with a particular bit of medicine. It might just be about giving them a couple of practical skills in the areas that they're worried about, and it could be something as simple as that, just by having that conversation and not really overthinking it, I suppose, and thinking you might need to bring in extra resources and signpost off to other centres and specialists and things. Asking are things you're uncertain about. Do you need support with any particular aspect of caregiving tasks? You know, whether it be in terms of information or being shown how to do something, or just having more information about it, knowledge about it, or even just the information that you're actually doing that task right. Sometimes it's about just reassuring, isn't it? You are doing a good job.
Yeah, never underestimate actually reassurance and saying, hey, you know, you're doing that right. You're doing a really good job there.
Yeah, I think that would mean a lot to a lot of people actually, in any walk of life, not just our end of life carers.
Yeah, definitely, and I think that really links as well with support, which is a theme that we're going to talk about next. And I know that accessible information for carers was linked to better mental health in carers, so that also fits with what we're talking about today.
Yeah, exactly.
Great, I think we'll tie that up there. That's been a really interesting conversation, and hopefully for some of the people listening, it might have given you some ideas about how you can use what we've found. We've discussed some of the ways that you might be able to use that if you're in a conversation with a carer, just to check in to see if they're doing okay, and see if you might be able to help them to overcome some of the mental health problems that we might, and challenges that we might be seeing from some of these issues. So thank you, Gunn, and thank you, Tracy. As we mentioned several times, there are other podcasts on some of the other themes, so do check them out if this is something you're interested in. Tell a colleague if you think there's other people you know who might be interested. And there's lots of information on our website. Thank you again for tuning in today, and we look forward to speaking to you some other time about our research.